Hey guys, tonight we're drifting back into the Middle Ages. So grab a blanket, dim the lights, and let's take a calm little wander into one of history's less glamorous corners. We're not looking at knights in shining armor or romantic castles tonight. Nope. We're going to the grim but oddly fascinating world of punishments. Specifically, the kind of punishments invented for women. Because, as medieval societies often reminded everyone, equality was not exactly a thing. Now, punishments in the medieval period were rarely about justice, as we'd imagine it today. They were more about keeping order, humiliating people into obedience, and making an example out of someone in front of their neighbors. And while both men and women could be punished, there were some very special, very creative forms of discipline that were mostly reserved for women. Because apparently someone in the town council woke up one day and thought, how can we make public humiliation just a bit more gendered? Let's start with one of the most famous contraptions, the ducking stool. Picture it, a sturdy wooden chair attached to a long beam. That beam was balanced on a fulcrum, like a seesaw from a nightmare. A woman was strapped into the chair, paraded through town, and then lowered into a pond or river. Up and down she went, like a human yo-yo, splashing in cold, muddy water while the locals cheered, gawked, and sometimes threw things for extra entertainment. The ducking stool was most famously used for so-called scolds. That's the medieval word for a woman who talks too much, nags, or argues with her husband, which, let's be honest, probably meant any woman who expressed an opinion. And medieval society really could not handle that. So instead of, say, having an adult conversation, they built a chair that turned a wife into part of...
Now, the ducking stool wasn't just about scolds. It could also be used for suspected witches, and in that context, things got even darker. The logic was, well, medieval. If a woman drowned, she was innocent. If she floated, clearly she was a witch. Either way, not exactly a win. And while this wasn't the most common witch testing method, it did cement the ducking stool as a kind of one-size-fits-all tool of female humiliation. Let's float, pun intended, over to another medieval invention, the scold's bridle. This was a metal cage, sort of like a helmet, locked onto a woman's head. It usually came with an iron plate that went inside the mouth, pressing down the tongue so the wearer couldn't speak. Sometimes they even added spikes, so if you tried to talk, you'd stab your own tongue. Very charming. The bridle was used in parts of Britain and continental Europe, and again, the main crime was being a scold. Too loud, too gossipy, too opinionated, basically not silent and obedient. The woman would be forced to wear this heavy iron contraption and sometimes parade it through the streets so everyone could see how society dealt with a mouthy neighbor.
And while the bridle didn't usually kill, it could cause injury, infection, or long-term damage. You didn't walk away from one of those parades without scars, physical or emotional, which was sort of the point. The punishment was less about correction and more about spectacle, and about reinforcing the idea that women should keep quiet, or else. Let's pause here for a moment. Imagine living in a small medieval town. The houses are close together. Everyone knows everyone else's business. Gossip travels faster than the plague. And in the middle of this claustrophobic little community, public punishments are staged as a kind of civic theater. It's easy to forget that these punishments weren't carried out in private cells or hidden away. They were public. They were communal. The whole point was that everyone had to see. And so when a woman was strapped to a stool and dunked...
All right, so we've ducked a few women in rivers and strapped a couple of others into iron muzzles. Very medieval, very theatrical.
But of course, societies across Europe never stopped at just one or two humiliating devices. Why waste a perfectly good opportunity to get creative with punishment? One of the strangest and honestly most petty forms of medieval discipline was something called a charivari. The name sounds almost festive, like it should be a folk dance or a dessert. But no. A charivari was essentially a noisy, mocking parade staged by neighbors. It usually targeted people who had violated community norms, but women, especially wives who were seen as disobedient, were prime candidates. Here's how it worked. If a woman was accused of nagging too much, being disorderly, or, heaven forbid, bossing her husband around, the townsfolk would gather outside her house at night. They would bang pots and pans, blow horns, and shout insults. Sometimes they'd even build an effigy of the guilty woman and parade it through the streets, often in ridiculous poses, like riding backward on a donkey, which was the medieval equivalent of being roasted in a meme. The goal wasn't to physically hurt anyone, but to shame them into proper behavior. Imagine trying to go to sleep while your neighbors are outside for 3 nights straight, clanging cookware because you told your husband to take out the trash. Medieval noise complaints were on another level. Now, sometimes the charivari escalated. In a few regions, the actual accused woman would be dragged out and forced to participate in the noisy parade. She might be made to ride backward on a donkey herself while everyone jeered. And yes, people threw things, rotten eggs, spoiled vegetables, sometimes even animal parts. Nothing says respect your husband like being pelted with last week's turnips. Speaking of animal parts, let's talk about another bizarre punishment: carrying the dead animal. This one really highlights how much medieval justice loved symbolism. If a woman was caught committing adultery, or sometimes even accused of simple misbehavior, she might be punished by being forced to carry a dead animal, often a dog, a goose, or even a donkey's head, through the streets. Why? Well, the logic was loose, to put it politely. The dead animal was a symbol of shame, filth, and improper behavior. Basically, you behaved badly, so now you carry this carcass as a walking billboard of dishonor. And of course, the worse the alleged crime, the bigger the animal. Some unlucky women had to drag whole donkeys or carry massive baskets of rotten fish on their backs while neighbors followed along laughing. Which raises a simple question. How many times did a punishment committee have to say, "Go fetch me a goose," before someone wondered if maybe they'd lost the plot? Now, carrying smelly things was just one form of public shaming. Let's not forget the classic medieval favorite, the pillory. The pillory was a wooden structure with holes for the head and hands.
Let's take a quiet moment here.
The accused person
Because when
was
we
locked
talk
in,
about all these punishments,
standing in a public
they can
square
sound
for hours or
cartoonishly
even
absurd. Riding donkeys backward, carrying dead animals, being dunked like an unwanted biscuit. It's easy to laugh at the ridiculousness, but for the women who lived through it, the humiliation was very real. We're talking about small towns, tightly knit communities, where reputation meant everything. Being paraded around in front of your neighbors wasn't just a bad afternoon. It could destroy your social standing, your family's livelihood, even your chances of survival. In a world where you relied on your neighbors for trade, labor, and basic support, becoming a public joke was devastating. And that's really the through line of all these punishments. They weren't just about pain or discomfort. They were about control. They told women, your behavior, your words, your relationships, all of it is under surveillance. And if you step outside the boundaries, the entire community will turn you into entertainment. Let's wander now into another punishment, one that combines public humiliation with just a dash of violence: the whipping post. Whipping was not unique to women, of course, but the way it was applied to them carried its own social meaning. A woman accused of theft, adultery, or being a prostitute might be stripped to the waist and whipped in the market square. The physical pain was obvious, but again, the real sting was public shame.
And unlike the ducking stool, which at least gave you a chance to dry off, whipping left permanent marks. It was a punishment you literally carried on your body. Sometimes whipping was combined with banishment. After the lashes, a woman might be driven out of town, forced to walk barefoot along the roads until she reached the next settlement. That way, her humiliation didn't end when the lashes stopped. It traveled with her. All of this, of course, was carefully staged. Medieval justice wasn't chaotic. It was theatrical, symbolic, and meant to be remembered, which is why punishments for women lean so heavily on performance. Ducking, parading, wearing iron bridles, carrying smelly animals. It was all about the spectacle. And in the absence of modern entertainment, nothing brought a crowd together like seeing their neighbor shamed for scolding her husband. Now, as we float through these medieval town squares, let's remember, these punishments weren't universal. Not every woman in every town faced them. Local laws varied, customs shifted, but across much of Europe, the themes were the same. Control women's speech, control their behavior, and use shame as the main weapon. And that really sums up the medieval mindset. Punishments didn't have to make logical sense. They just had to send a message. And if that message involved geese, bells, or buckets of mud, so be it.
So far, we've been splashing women in rivers, locking them into iron muzzles, and making them parade through town with deceased livestock, which already feels like a medieval fever dream. But of course, if there's one area where punishments for women reached their most surreal heights, it was in the world of trials by ordeal and witch hunts. Now, the word ordeal wasn't just metaphorical in the Middle Ages. It was an actual legal category. The idea was that God himself would intervene in a trial and reveal guilt or innocence, which sounds comforting in theory, but in practice, it meant subjecting people, often women, to painful, humiliating, and sometimes fatal tests, because nothing says divine justice like third-degree burns. One of the classic ordeals was the ordeal by water. We touched on this earlier with ducking stools, but let's be more precise. A woman accused of witchcraft, adultery, or other serious offenses might be bound hand and foot, then tossed into a pond or river. If she sank, the water had accepted her, and she was innocent. If she floated, the water rejected her.
Now, speaking of witchcraft, this is where medieval punishments took their most dramatic turn. For centuries, belief in witches floated around Europe like background noise. But by the late Middle Ages, accusations began to spike. And while not every accused witch was a woman, the majority certainly were. The image of the witch was closely tied to ideas about unruly, independent, or simply unlucky women. Widows, healers, midwives, basically anyone who lived outside the neat box of obedient wife or cloistered nun could be a target. Punishments for witchcraft varied. Sometimes it was just a fine or public shaming, but in the more notorious cases, it meant execution. And while we won't go into gory detail, because that's not exactly bedtime material, the most common punishments included hanging or burning at the stake. Both were chosen not just for efficiency, but for spectacle. The whole town was expected to watch, because, once again, justice in the Middle Ages was theater first, punishment second. And let's pause here to notice something. All these punishments, ordeals, ducking, pillories, witch burnings, they weren't really about discovering truth. They were about reinforcing control. The outcomes were almost pre-decided. If a woman floated, she was guilty. If her wounds festered, she was guilty. If she confessed under torture, guilty again. Heads I win, tails you lose. But sometimes, medieval punishments weren't about witchcraft at all. They were about policing the everyday boundaries of morality. For example, punishments for adultery. Now, in theory, adultery was a sin for both men and women. But in practice,
Women faced harsher consequences. In many towns, a woman accused of cheating on her husband could be marched through the streets wearing nothing but a simple shift, with her hair cut short while neighbors jeered. Sometimes she was flogged. Sometimes she was forced to wear a symbolic garment, like a cloak painted with horns, to mark her as unfaithful. Men, meanwhile, often got off with fines, because apparently male adultery was just a little oops, while female adultery was a civic emergency. And while the church liked to insist that marriage was sacred, the reality was that most of these punishments weren't about saving souls. They were about protecting male honor and social order, which is why punishments for women almost always emphasized shame. Make her visible, make her ridiculous, make sure everyone remembers what happens when a wife steps out of line.
Now, not every punishment was deadly serious. Some were just weirdly theatrical. In certain German towns, for example, adulterous women might be forced to wear clothing inside out or don a special headdress that marked them out for ridicule. Others were made to crawl on their hands and knees through the marketplace. Symbolism everywhere, always a reminder that your body was a billboard for your supposed sins. And here's where the irony comes in again. Medieval society was obsessed with modesty and female virtue. Women were supposed to be covered, quiet, obedient. But when they were punished, they were often stripped, displayed, or forced into ridiculous costumes. The very values that claimed to protect women's honor were turned inside out during punishment, weaponizing shame as the ultimate control mechanism. Let's float gently toward the end of this section with one more example, the cucking stool. It was similar to the ducking stool, but instead of dipping a woman in water, it was basically just a chair of shame. A woman accused of being a scold or sometimes of committing adultery would be strapped into the stool and wheeled through town like a grim parade float. No dunking, just pure, slow-motion humiliation. The stool might be decorated with mocking signs, or the woman might be forced to hold symbolic objects, like a distaff for laziness or a pair of horns for infidelity. Then she'd be left in a public spot for hours so everyone passing by could get a good look. Imagine being stuck on display in the town square while your neighbors casually stop to buy bread and toss an insult your way. Not exactly ideal for the social calendar. So, whether it was through ordeals, witch trials, or endless variations of public shaming, the Middle Ages made one thing clear. Women's behavior wasn't just personal, it was public property. Every scold, every slip, every accusation was turned into community entertainment. And the punishments, bizarre as they sound to us now, were deadly serious in their purpose. They were there to control, to remind every woman watching that her place was precarious, that society's patience was thin, and that if she stepped out of line, she too could end up carrying a goose through the marketplace or strapped into a stool by the river.
Part 4. Marital Misery and the Laws of Wifely Obedience. So far, we've waded through duck ponds, iron masks, charivaris, and witch trials. All very lively. But if there was one area where medieval punishments for women really flourished, it was in the marital arena. Because, let's face it, marriage in the Middle Ages wasn't just about love or companionship, it was a contract, a hierarchy, and, unfortunately, a stage where punishments could play out. Let's start with the basics. Medieval marriage laws were designed to maintain a very specific order: husband in charge, wife obedient. Deviate from that structure and the punishments could get creative. Some were community-driven, like charivaris, but others were written into local codes. Take, for instance, the symbolic punishments for disobedient wives. In certain towns in France and Germany, if a woman was accused of dominating her husband, what they called being a henpecker, she could be sentenced to ride through the streets on a donkey. But not just sitting politely, oh no, she had to ride backward.
That way, everyone could see her face, and everyone knew exactly why she was being paraded. Sometimes the donkey itself was dressed up for the occasion, draped in old rags or decorated with mocking signs. And if that wasn't humiliating enough, the husband might be forced to lead the donkey by a rope. The message was clear. This is what happens when wives don't know their place, which in medieval logic was apparently somewhere between silent and invisible. Now, what's interesting here is how these punishments weren't just aimed at women, they also indirectly shamed men. A husband with a rebellious wife was seen as weak, unable to control his household. So punishing the wife doubled as a way to restore the husband's reputation. Because clearly, nothing screams masculine authority than parading your spouse through town on a donkey in front of your neighbors. Let's move to another layer of marital discipline: financial punishments. In some regions, if a wife was caught in adultery or accused of wasting her husband's resources, her dowry could be seized. That might not sound dramatic compared to ducking stools, but in a world where property and survival were tied to marriage, it was devastating. Lose your dowry and you lost your security. It was a punishment that kept echoing long after the public shaming ended.
But of course, the more theatrical punishments didn't disappear. Public beatings were sometimes prescribed for wives accused of adultery or disobedience. And while men might face fines or brief shaming for the same offenses, women's punishments were always heavier on humiliation. Public exposure was the theme. And then we get to the bizarre symbolic punishments. These are the ones where medieval authorities got very specific about props and costumes. In certain towns, adulterous women were forced to wear horns strapped to their heads, symbolizing cuckoldry. Others had to carry brooms, distaffs, or spinning wheels through the streets, tools of domestic labor twisted into symbols of their supposed failings. Imagine the scene. A woman trudging through the marketplace, clutching a distaff while children laugh and neighbors point. On paper, it sounds ridiculous. In practice, it was devastating, because the whole point was to make her a walking emblem of shame, a human cautionary tale. Now, let's pause here to notice a pattern. These punishments often blurred the line between justice and ritual theater. They weren't really about correcting behavior. They were about broadcasting a message to the entire community. Women's bodies, words, and choices were under surveillance, and deviation would be punished not privately, but publicly. And while all this might sound like a uniquely medieval obsession, we should remember, this was a deeply communal world. Privacy, as we know it today, didn't exist. Your neighbors knew everything, from how much bread you baked to how often your chimney smoked. So it's not surprising that punishment became a public spectacle. But even within this spectacle, gender mattered. Men might be fined, jailed, or occasionally whipped. Women were turned into performances. They were dressed up, displayed, paraded, dunked, muzzled. Punishment wasn't just about the crime. It was about using women's very visibility as the method of discipline. Let's also not forget the church's role in this. Ecclesiastical courts, which handled issues of marriage and morality, often prescribed humiliating penances for women. These could include standing barefoot in church, wearing only a shift, confessing sins publicly, or fasting for extended periods. Again, not violent in themselves, but deeply humiliating in a society where modesty and reputation were everything.
And sometimes, punishments combined both church and civic theater. A woman might be forced to stand outside the church on Sunday, holding candles or wearing penitential clothing, so every single member of the community could see her shame before Mass. In that sense, religion and justice worked hand in hand to enforce obedience. Let's float gently toward the end of this section with a final example: the mock trial of quarrelsome couples. In parts of Europe, when a husband and wife were known for constant public arguing, the community could stage a parody trial. Neighbors would gather, act out exaggerated versions of the couple's quarrels, and sometimes even drag the real husband and wife into the performance. The wife, unsurprisingly, bore the brunt of the mockery. Afterward, the couple might be paraded through town, or the wife punished with symbolic tasks. It was comedy, but with sharp edges. Everyone laughed, but the laughter reinforced the same message: women should be silent, obedient, and invisible. Step outside those boundaries, and the whole town turns your life into theater. So, marital punishments weren't just about individual behavior. They were about the larger social order, about reinforcing hierarchy, about making sure every wife watching knew exactly what would happen if she became too loud, too independent, or simply too unlucky.
We've covered ducking stools, iron bridles, donkey rides, and even God-approved burn tests. But believe it or not, medieval society didn't stop there. Because if there's one thing medieval people loved almost as much as public shaming, it was policing clothing. Now, clothing in the Middle Ages wasn't just about staying warm. It was a social code, a billboard, and sometimes a weapon. What you wore told the world your class, your trade, your marital status, and even your supposed morality. And so, of course, there were punishments that used clothing, or the lack of it, to humiliate women. Let's start with sumptuary laws. These were laws that dictated what people could or couldn't wear, depending on their status. In many regions, women were explicitly targeted. For example, in England, prostitutes were sometimes required to wear striped hoods or special bands of cloth so everyone could identify them instantly. No chance of blending in at church or in the marketplace. You had to walk around as a permanent, wearable scarlet letter. In Italy, similar rules applied, but with even more flair. Venetian prostitutes, for instance, were at times ordered to wear yellow scarves, so there was no mistaking them for respectable women. And since yellow was already associated with things like disease and betrayal, it wasn't exactly the most flattering shade. The goal wasn't fashion. The goal was stigma. And prostitutes weren't the only ones. Adulterous wives, too, could be forced into humiliating garments. In some German towns, a convicted woman might be paraded through the streets in nothing but her undergarments, or forced to wear her husband's clothing as a mark of ridicule. Others had to don cloaks painted with horns, making them walking advertisements of infidelity. The symbolism was never subtle. If you broke the rules of marriage or morality,
Now,
your
sometimes
clothes
the
would
punishment
broadcast
wasn't
it
about
for
adding
everyone to
clothing,
see.
but taking it away. Public stripping was a common humiliation for women. A wife caught in adultery might be stripped to her shift and forced to walk barefoot through town. And while technically modest by medieval standards, the effect was still devastating. To be exposed in public without your normal garments was to be stripped not just of modesty, but of social standing. And here's where the irony comes in again. The very same societies that insisted on modesty, veils, and layers of clothing as proof of female virtue were quick to strip women bare as punishment. Modesty was sacred, until shame was needed, and then it was disposable. Let's also talk about hair. In many places, women's hair was seen as a symbol of honor and femininity. Cutting it off was a deeply symbolic punishment. Adulterous women might have their heads shaved as a permanent mark of disgrace. Sometimes their hair was burned publicly to make the shame even more dramatic. In a world where wigs weren't yet common and where long hair was tied to beauty, this was devastating. You couldn't just bounce back with a quick trip to the salon. And the punishments didn't stop there. In France, there were cases of women forced to wear mock crowns, made of paper, leather, or even metal, decorated with symbols of their crimes. A woman accused of gossip might wear a crown with little bells.
An adulteress might wear one shaped like horns. Picture a medieval carnival hat, except instead of being funny, it was a mobile announcement of your downfall. In some towns, there were even special shoes used for punishment. Oversized, heavy, or awkwardly shaped footwear could be forced on women as they were paraded through the streets. The clumsy walk only added to the laughter of the crowd, because medieval punishment always loved turning suffering into theater. Let's pause here and think about why clothing punishments mattered so much. In a society without mass media, clothing was one of the clearest markers of identity. You couldn't Google someone's background or scroll through their Instagram. You judged them by what they wore. So when the law forced a woman into striped hoods, shaved her head, or paraded her in her undergarments, it wasn't just a temporary humiliation. It could destroy her reputation for life.
Neighbors remembered. Communities remembered. And since women's survival was often tied to marriage, reputation, and networks of support, these punishments could be socially fatal. Now, another interesting twist: forced pilgrimages. Sometimes instead of or alongside humiliating clothing, women were sentenced to walk long distances to a holy site, dressed in penitential garb. That might mean walking barefoot in a simple shift, carrying candles, or wearing a rough wool cloak. The punishment wasn't just the journey, but the spectacle of being seen on that journey, visibly marked as someone paying for sins. It's worth noting that men sometimes faced clothing-based punishments too, but again, the difference was in emphasis. Men might be fined or stripped of armor or symbols of rank. Women were turned into public displays, walking billboards of shame, defined by what they wore or didn't wear. And the theatrical nature of these punishments really shows us how much medieval justice was about visibility. Crime wasn't just punished, it was displayed. And women, more than anyone else, were turned into living symbols of disobedience, morality, or shame. Let's drift quietly toward the close of this section with one last image. A woman, head shaved, barefoot, walking slowly through her town in a simple shift, while children laugh, neighbors whisper, and bells ring from her crown of paper horns. It might sound absurd to us, but in the Middle Ages, this was deadly serious. A punishment designed not to kill, but to scar. Not to wound the body, but to break the spirit.
So far, we've paraded women on donkeys, shaved their heads, and made them wear embarrassing hats. All very theatrical. But we can't forget the church, that ever-watchful, ever-judging presence in medieval life. Because while the town square offered its own punishments, the church had its own arsenal of spiritual humiliations. And spoiler, they were just as creative. Let's start with public penance. If a woman was caught in adultery, accused of gossip, or even just suspected of loose morals, the church might not dunk her in a pond. Instead, she'd be sentenced to stand outside the church door on Sunday morning, dressed in penitential clothing. Usually, this meant barefoot, in a simple shift, sometimes with ashes sprinkled on her head. She'd stand there while the entire congregation filed in, every neighbor walking past, seeing her shame before worship. And then, to add to the humiliation, she had to sit through the Mass afterward, often at the very front, where everyone could see her. No quiet corner pew, no slipping in late, just a spotlight of shame under stained glass. Sometimes this penance lasted more than one Sunday. A woman might be sentenced to repeat the ritual for weeks or even months. Every week, the same humiliation, the same whispered comments from neighbors, the same children pointing and giggling. It wasn't about one act of repentance. It was about branding her with a long public memory. Now, penance didn't always stop at standing quietly. In some places, women had to carry symbols of their sins into church. Adulterous women might hold candles shaped like horns. Gossiping women might carry a wooden tongue exaggeratedly long, as if to say, "See, this is what happens when you can't keep quiet." Medieval comedy at its cruelest. And, of course, there were pilgrimages. Sometimes, instead of being whipped or dunked, a woman might be ordered to walk to a holy shrine, barefoot, wearing penitential garb, carrying candles or a cross. On paper, this might sound almost merciful compared to drowning chairs, but in reality, it was exhausting, dangerous, and deeply humiliating.
Imagine trudging for days, maybe weeks, along muddy medieval roads, barefoot, with everyone who passed you knowing exactly why you were walking. You weren't on a joyful spiritual retreat, you were marked, humiliated, and forced to display your sin with every step. Now, let's talk about excommunication. This was the church's nuclear option. To be excommunicated meant being cut off from the sacraments, from burial in consecrated ground, from the community of faith. And in the Middle Ages, that wasn't just a religious slap on the wrist, it was social death. For women, excommunication was often tied to sins of the body, adultery, prostitution, witchcraft, or even disobedience to ecclesiastical orders. And while men could be excommunicated too, the effect on women was often harsher. Without church membership, a woman lost credibility, protection, and sometimes even the right to appeal for justice. She became an outsider in a world where survival depended on community. Sometimes excommunication came with public ritual. A woman might be formally cursed in front of the congregation, bells tolling, candles extinguished one by one as the priest pronounced her outside the faith. Imagine standing there, everyone watching, as the light was symbolically snuffed out, leaving you in darkness. And if that sounds dramatic, well, it was meant to be. The church knew the power of symbolism. Where the town might use donkeys and goose carcasses, the church used fire, ash, bells, and silence. Both were theater. Both were designed to break people down. Now, there's another fascinating detail. Forced confession in public.
In some cases, women accused of immorality had to stand before the congregation and verbally confess their sins. Not quietly in a booth, whispered to a priest, but loudly for everyone to hear. And sometimes these confessions were written down and read aloud, even if the woman herself refused. A priest or town official would announce the sins to the community. Truth, rumor, or outright invention, it didn't really matter. The point was humiliation. This practice blurred the line between religious penance and civic punishment. Because once a confession was out in the open, the entire town carried it like gossip, and the woman's reputation was destroyed long after the candles were snuffed out. Let's pause here, because while it's easy to roll our eyes at the absurdity, paper crowns, goose parades, wooden tongues, these punishments reveal something deeper. They weren't just random cruelties, they were carefully crafted rituals of control. The town had its methods, the church had its methods. Both leaned heavily on visibility. Women's bodies were turned into the canvas for punishment. Their silence, their clothing, their hair, their footsteps, everything could be weaponized. And at the heart of it was fear. Fear of disorder. Fear of female voices that might carry too far. Fear of bodies that didn't conform. Fear of women who lived outside the narrow boundaries of obedience. So, in the dimly lit spaces of medieval churches, women stood barefoot, holding candles, heads shaved, confessions forced into the air, all while neighbors nodded and whispered, carrying the memory long after the ritual ended.